Of the four key elements, when it comes to composition, composition is the number one, the most important. And we already understand that composition is the placement of elements, masses, shapes, lines, and angles. One of the easiest ways to start to get a basic understanding of certain areas that you want to avoid. You want to avoid drawing people's attention to the center. You want to avoid drawing people's attention out of the composition into corners. These are things you don't want to do. If you have, let's say, hills going up, you don't want to drop them down as they move out of the composition. If you have, let's say, a table sitting somewhere, you don't want to have a person standing right next to it and draw a conflict, have things touching. You know, in other words, like hills of different perspectives when they come in and they cross over. A lot of things to avoid. But one of the basic rules in composition of things that you do want to do, starting with some very basics, is what's called the rule of thirds. You have a composition area to work in, divide it in thirds in both directions, both vertical and horizontal. This is real basic. You could use this line for your skyline. In other words, you can put some hills coming across on there, or you could come, if you have this situation, you're going to say to the viewer to look at the landscape versus looking at the sky. If you have your skyline down here and some hills way off in the distance and clouds up here, things like this, a beautiful sunset or sunrise, this is saying look at the sky. The eye is moved up. Working with the rule of thirds, you could have a focal point off towards one of these areas, sun setting here, moving to one of the thirds, the intersection of the thirds. Trees, if a tree is going to be your focal point, it could come up and move on this line. You don't want to have it over here too close to the edge or too near center. A group of trees with your main tree being on one of the vertical lines of the thirds. Another one to use that's very good is called the golden section. There's books, there's tons of information on the internet about the golden section, the golden rectangle, and what it is a ratio of 1.618 approximately, infinitum with zeros. And that means, in other words, if this is your square, without using a ruler here, this side of the square times 1.618 would be the length of this side. This is what's called a golden rectangle. And you can use various different intersecting points. Take this times 1.618 would be more like this, okay? And then here's another golden rectangle. And you can continue to do that, another golden rectangle. And you develop what's called a golden curve. This is something that has been in nature. Comets, some Halley's Comet, various comets take this type of curve. The Nautilus seashell. And the thing about the golden section is we find it's one of the most pleasing curves to look at, one of the most pleasing rectangles versus a way too long rectangle. You know, it's good for some things. I'm not saying you can't break the rules or a perfect square, but the golden section is a wonderful way to compose your composition using various intersection points as your focal point. And you can continue to have things move along to a certain degree along this. The old masters, you can take this math and just keep moving it on and on and on. Like I say, books and all types of things about the golden section. And so in your basic composition, it's all about telling your story. A horizontal rectangle is going to be better for panoramic views left to right. A horizontal or excuse me, a vertical rectangle is better if you want to move the person up. And as I said earlier, the placement of the horizon tells the person to look up. The placement of a horizon here might be great for a canyon, telling the person to look down and see what's inside the canyon or river. You know, so wherever you place your horizon begins to help move the viewer through the painting and saying look down what's in it. Or if it's down here, you've got all the clouds moving up, beautiful thunderheads and all, and then you decide your focal point's going to be right here. You could have a tree that intersects there, or some hills come across here. So we use our composition to move the person through the scene. We tell a story. Say, I want you to look at something that moving this way or that way. You want to avoid dropping them out. Use your hills if it's down here. Angles go up right at the last minute versus going down. We also want to consider the placement of major shapes, masses within the composition besides just movement of angles and lines, in working on the basic rule of thirds. Your major masses draw attention. In other words, you could have a large shape close into this area, whatever, you know, thinking of abstract, some kind of shape, but the shape is not just lines, it's made up of a value, a dark value. Let's say you're working with clouds and you have a very low eye line. You're saying look up. Here's one major shape, and keep in mind that contrast draws attention. You've got some very dark clouds here, very dark shadows, and this is going to become our focal point. Then as we move off, let's say we want to move in a shape going around there. So in the distance we have some additional clouds, but they don't have near as dark of shadows. The distant clouds don't have near the contrast. They're very light. The darks aren't very dark, and the lights aren't as light as you're going to have on the clouds that are in the focal point. And that draws attention, contrast, dark against light. And as you move your way through with additional shapes, keep in mind values, darks and lights. And we could have another big thunderhead off in here. But there again, the darks aren't as dark as where you want to draw the attention. The lights aren't as light as in contrast with this mass and shape. So composition, the placement of shapes and masses, controlled by movement, darks and lights, contrast, draw your attention. Generally, shape also, generally, size has a great deal to do with it, but the size of a dark mass, you could have other darks over in here, but they're just not as big as this one. You could have large areas of light, but they're not as large. So shape and size will also control the viewer through the composition.